Good morning. Welcome to today's PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade informational webinar. Today we're going to provide a very high-level overview of the 8th grade PSAT 8-9 administration for spring of 2019. For those of you that are associated with high schools and have been giving the PSAT 8-9 to 9th grade, a lot of this will be very familiar to you. And if you are in a middle school or junior high, a lot of this will be new to you, and we will kind of start with the general ideas of what is the PSAT and so on. The PSAT 8-9 will be administered to 8th graders in place of the MSTEP English Language Arts, or ELA, and mathematics assessments. 8th graders will continue to take the MSTEP Science and Social Studies assessments. And because this is for accountability, the PSAT 8-9 is required for 8th graders. So today's topics in general include what is the PSAT 8-9, some information about the College Board reporting, how does the PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade compare to MSTEP, the test dates for 2019, and just some general information. The implementation activities, supports for students, including English learners and students who need accommodations. And then we'll talk about how we will support you in the 2018-19 school year so that you are prepared to administer the PSAT 8-9. And then if you are kind of raring to go to get things done now, what are those things that you can do now to prepare for next year? So first let's talk about what is the PSAT 8-9. The PSAT 8-9 is designed for 8th and 9th grade students. The PSAT 8-9 is a test that will help educators and students figure out what students need to work on most in the skills that are considered essential for success in high school, college, and career. Scores for the Michigan provided SAT suite of assessments, and those assessments include the SAT with Essay, the PSAT 10, and PSAT 8-9, are reported on a common vertical scale, allowing educators and students to measure progress. And we'll talk about what that vertical scale means in future slides. The test length and essentially the total testing time for students is 2 hours and 25 minutes. However, we encourage about 3 hours of planning so that you can include the breaks and also the pre-administration activities such as passing out books and collecting books when they're done. But the actual testing time for students is 2 hours and 25 minutes. One thing to note is this is a timed test, and students must be administered the PSAT 8-9 according to the scripts in the testing manuals. So that is a big difference between MSTEP and the PSAT 8-9. And there's no penalty for guessing, also known as rights-only scoring. The skills tested on the PSAT 8-9, the students will essentially take 3 tests, a reading test, a writing and language test, and a math test. Each test assesses the academic skills that students developed over the years, primarily through coursework. These skills are considered essential for success in high school, college, and career. So when we look at the scores, as I mentioned, students will take 3 tests, a reading test, writing and language, and a math test. And then from these 3 tests, 14 separate scores are derived and available to both students and educators. So if we look at this chart and we start kind of in the middle with those 3 test scores, students will get a score on each one of those tests from a range of 6 to 36. And then actually if we move down the chart, 6 sub-scores are derived from the 3 test scores. So we have a words and context and a command of evidence sub-score that are derived from both questions on the reading and the writing and language test. And then we have an expression of ideas and standard English convention sub-score, which is derived only from the writing and language test. From the math test, we derive 2 sub-scores, heart of algebra and problem solving and data analysis. As we work our way back up the chart then, above the test scores, we take questions from the reading, the writing and language test, and the math test, and give 2 cross-test scores, one for analysis and science, and then one for analysis in history and social studies. The reading and the writing and language tests get combined for an evidence-based reading and writing section score. And these section scores are on a 120 to 720 scale. And then the math test is converted into a math section score. The two section scores are added together to give a total score. So the sum of the two section scores is the total score, and for the PSAT 8-9, that range is 240 to 1440. Now let's talk about each test in a little bit more detail. So the reading test is 42 passage-based questions, and the students have 55 minutes to complete that assessment. There are 4 single passages and 1 pair of passages. All questions are multiple choice and based on those passages. Some passages are paired with other passages or informational graphics, such as charts, graphs, and tables. No mathematical computation is required. Prior topic-specific knowledge is never tested. And the reading test, as we mentioned, is part of the evidence-based reading and writing section. The reading test always includes 1 passage from a classic or contemporary work of U.S. or world literature, 1 passage or a pair of passages from either a U.S. founding document or a text in the great global conversation they inspired, the U.S. Constitution or a speech by Nelson Mandela, for example. The reading test also includes a selection about economics, psychology, sociology, or some other social science, 2 science passages, or 1 passage and 1 passage pair, that examine foundational concepts and developments in earth science, biology, chemistry, or physics. Prior knowledge of other content areas is not required, as the reading test will measure the ability of the student to read across the content areas and not measure their ability of the information within the content areas itself. The text complexity of the passages are taken from the 6th through 8th grade bands and the 9th through 10th grade level bands. The writing and language test has 40 passage-based questions, and the students have 30 minutes to complete this test. And the writing and language test has 4 passages. All questions are multiple choice and based on the passages. Some passages are paired with informational graphics, such as charts, graphs, and tables. No mathematical computation is required. Prior topic-specific knowledge is never tested. And again, the writing and language test is part of the evidence-based reading and writing section score. The writing and language test puts students in the active role of an editor who is improving a written passage. Most questions ask students to decide which, if any, of the 3 alternatives to an underlined part of the passage most improves it. The math test has 2 test sections, and students have 60 total minutes to complete the math test. There are 38 questions. 31 of those are multiple choice questions, and 7 are what we call grid-ins. Most of the math questions, as I said, will be multiple choice, but some will be the grid-ins or student-produced responses. The math test is divided into 2 portions. So there's one part where the students will be allowed to use a calculator, and one part where the students will not be allowed to use a calculator. Some parts of the test will present a scenario and then ask several questions about it. The math test focuses on the math that matters both for college and career readiness. To succeed on the math test, students will need to demonstrate mathematical practices such as problem solving and using appropriate tools strategically. In regards to how the PSAT 8-9 is scored, as I mentioned previously, we have rights-only scoring, which means that student gets 1 point for each correct answer. 0 points are deducted for each incorrect or blank question. And then also students will have the math grid-ins or the student-produced responses, where the students will enter their answers as reduced fractions or decimals. And then if rounding a decimal, make sure to use every box. So as we move along throughout the administration and throughout next year, we'll talk about the math grid-ins and some strategies that you can help your students prepare for that part of the math test. How does the PSAT 8-9 connect to the PSAT 10, the PSAT NMSQT, and the SAT? All tests within the SAT suite of assessments, so again, the SAT, PSAT NMSQT, PSAT 10, and PSAT 8-9, are aligned to the same research backbone and focus on the same domain of knowledge and skills. All tests in the SAT suite of assessments are on a common score scale that provides consistent feedback, enabling teachers to adjust instruction to better support students who are ahead or behind. So although all of these tests are considered a part of the SAT suite of assessments, we do want to call out that the PSAT and MSQT is an optional assessment that schools can choose to administer in the fall to 11th graders to qualify for the National Merit Scholarship Competition. This assessment is not provided by the Michigan Department of Education. Again, it is only administered in the fall. Some schools choose to administer it to 10th graders as well. However, only 11th graders can qualify for the National Merit Scholarship qualifying competition. So what does it mean that they're on a common vertical scale? Essentially what that means and what's meaningful to your students is that the score that students get on the PSAT 8-9 is the same score they would have gotten on the PSAT 10 or the SAT if they take it on the same day. The key thing here is that the scales, although they're on a common vertical scale, the scales themselves of the SAT, the PSAT 10, and the PSAT 8-9 are different. So as the image on the screen shows, the SAT section score, for instance, is on a 200 to 800 scale, whereas the PSAT 8-9 is on a 120 to 720 scale. So if a student earns a 580 on the math section, for instance, on the PSAT 8-9, this is the score a student would earn if they had taken the PSAT 10 or the SAT on the same day. However, since the total points possible are different, the score has a different meaning. For example, a 580 out of 720 on the PSAT 8-9 is considered a better score than a 580 out of an 800 on the SAT. And one of the key benefits of having this on a common vertical scale is that you can measure student growth from year to year. A student who stays at 580 in 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade is not showing any growth. In regards to the information that students receive, they will receive a paper score report. This contains information to help students improve their academic skills. It lists the skills that students have the best chance of improving with additional work. These paper score reports are mailed to schools in June, but can also be printed from the K-12 Educator portal once scores are released to educators, and we'll talk about that portal in a second. Also, if a student is over 13 years of age, they can sign up for an online College Board account, and they can get access to their scores for all of the suite assessments through their College Board account and receive an online score report. There are some resources that we have available to you to not only prepare yourself, but for your students for the PSAT 8-9. You may have heard that we do have personalized free SAT practice on Khan Academy, and you could go to that official SAT practice through satpractice.org. Please note, though, that the Khan Academy has free personalized SAT practice, but keep in mind that this is SAT level content. The use of SAT practice is not recommended for the PSAT 8-9, but other content on the Khan Academy may be appropriate. For general information about the PSAT 8-9, you can visit psat.org/8-9. And then we also have a PSAT 8-9 student guide, and the URL is available on this link, or you can Google it. And this has information for the students about the assessment, some practice questions, and how to help them prepare. Now let's talk about the College Board reporting features that are available to you. The College Board provides dynamic reports to educators, schools, and districts through an electronic score reporting portal. Reports allow educators to drill down to individual student performance and also view the actual test questions, answer explanations, and perform item analysis. With the implementation of the SAT suite of assessments, Michigan has developed a robust infrastructure within the state that understands the College Board reporting portal. This includes ISDs and RESAs, as well as membership organizations including MASSP, MEMSPA, and MCAN. Workshops and training on the use of the portal are available through multiple channels and partnerships. The College Board's Michigan Field Team is scheduling initial workshops for the PSAT 8-9 in grade 8 with local ISDs and RESAs, and so you can contact your local ISD and RESA for information on if anything is scheduled in your area. Several professional organizations offer workshops at their various conferences, and we'll also have webinar versions available. Many of your high school colleagues have experience with the College Board Reporting Portal as they've administered assessments in the last few years. So your high school colleagues are also a great resource to reach out to ask about the portal. One thing to note, however, though, is that the official accountability data that you will receive for the PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade must be accessed from the OEAA secure site. The College Board Reporting Portal is not official accountability data. So we have a variety of types in reports and suggested uses for those reports. So for instance, we have a roster report that will list all of the students and their scores on a single test, which you can filter or drill down to individual students. You can view scores by institutions. You can view scores by different demographics. You can also provide or conduct question analysis reports where you can see the answer explanations. You can compare your school's performance on each question to district, state, and total group performances. Additionally, there are instructional planning reports. This is where you can view aggregate and student level performances on subscores. You can identify the subscores to focus on intervention and curriculum review, or see how your subscores map to your state standards. We also have benchmarks by institution reports and scores by demographics. Now let's talk about how the PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade compares to the M-STEP. So things that will be the same for the M-STEP, students are still going to be pre-ID'd in the secure site for the PSAT 8-9. So by pre-IDing the students in the secure site, this essentially creates your material order. So test materials will be sent based on the number of students that are pre-ID'd in the secure site by the deadline. In that deadline, we don't have a specific date, but is usually in February. Things that will be different than the M-STEP. So College Board assessments are timed and do not allow for self-pacing. So it's probably going to be a big difference for you and your students. Students must use the entire time allotted for each test. So if they are approved for extended time, students must use the entire time for which they are approved. Even if they're the only student testing in that room, they need to sit for the entire time that they are allotted. Another big difference is that students will take a paper pencil administration for the PSAT 8-9 in 2019. There is no option for a digital assessment. The M-STEP content area test, though, however, will still be a digital assessment. Unless absent, students are expected to test on the initial test day, which we will talk about what those test days are momentarily. And the standardized nature of the SAT suite of assessments requires an advanced accommodation request for the universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations required by students that would have traditionally been used on the M-STEP. So schools must request accommodations through the College Board online system, which is known as SSD Online, and SSD stands for Services for Students with Disabilities. The PSAT 8-9 is aligned to a range of math and ELA content standards selected by the College Board, which actually includes standards from grades above and below grade 8 in Michigan. The PSAT 8-9 differs from other 3 through 8th summative assessments for math and ELA, where the content alignment is solely based on the grade level assessed. MDE recommends educators continue to focus on teaching the 8th grade standards to 8th graders, which should lead to success on the PSAT 8-9 in 8th grade. The PSAT is a valuable tool which can set a starting point to begin progressing towards success on the SAT. Now let's talk about the test dates for 2019 and just some general information about those dates and who can test when. Schools must administer the PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade and the SAT with essay on April 9th, 2019, unless students are approved with accommodations that designate them to test in the accommodated testing window. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. Schools must administer the PSAT 8-9 for 9th grade and PSAT 10 on April 9, April 10, or April 11th, 2019, again, unless students are approved with accommodations that designate them to test in the accommodated testing window. Schools can choose which of those 3 dates works best for them as the initial test day. So you can choose between the 9th, the 10th, or the 11th, whichever day works best for your school. The same grade must test on the same day at the same time. So you can't have half of your 9th graders test in the morning and half of them test in the afternoon. You have to have the same grade test on the same day at the same time for that initial test day. Schools can administer multiple grades in one day. So if you have the capacity to test your 9th or your 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th graders all on April 9th, then you have the ability to do so if you so choose. All students except those who are absent or approved to test on the accommodated window are expected to test on the initial test day. Now we'll talk about the makeup opportunities and the accommodated testing window. Schools can then flexibly schedule students who miss the initial test day for PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade, PSAT 8-9 for 9th grade, and PSAT 10 for a makeup anytime between April 10th through 16th or April 23rd and April 24th. All makeup testing must be completed by April 24th. So you could choose either or both of those windows to provide your makeup testing for students. Students that miss a primary test day for the SAT with essay must take the makeup on April 23rd, however. For the accommodated testing window, all students with approved accommodations taking the PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade, PSAT 8-9 for 9th grade, and the PSAT 10 can flexibly be scheduled anytime in the accommodated testing window. So as long as a student taking the PSAT has approved accommodations, no matter what the accommodation is, they can be flexibly scheduled anytime from April 9th to April 23rd. It's slightly different for SAT, however. Students with approved accommodations taking the SAT with essay, as designated on the Non-Standard Administration Report, or something we call the NAR, in SSD Online, can flexibly be scheduled anytime in the accommodated testing window. So if you're also administering the SAT to your 11th graders, when you go into SSD Online, you will print what's called the NAR, or the Non-Standard Administration Report, and that will tell you which students are eligible to test in the accommodated testing window. Afternoon testing is allowed for PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade, PSAT 8-9 for 9th grade, and PSAT 10. However, afternoon testing is not available for the SAT with essay. 8th and 9th graders can test together in the same room if necessary. Please note this may change in future years, but is allowable for 2019. And one key note is that, again, your material orders for all of the Michigan provided assessments will be based on the students who are pre-ID'd in the secure site. So please, please, please do not place an order for the Michigan provided spring PSAT 8-9 for 8th grade, the PSAT 8-9 for 9th grade, PSAT 10, or the SAT with essay in the College Board test ordering system. Now, if your school is providing or administering fall assessments that, again, are not provided by the state of Michigan, but is your own school or district is paying for those, you would go into our test ordering system. But anything that is the Michigan provided assessments, you do not go into a test ordering system. You will pre-ID your students on the secure site, and that's what will create the test material order for you. Let's talk about some key activities about implementation. One thing you want to start thinking about is the staff that can serve in the following roles. So the first role is the Grade 8 Test Coordinator. This will be the person in charge of planning for the PSAT 8-9 for the 8th grade administration. You'll also want to think about your PSAT Backup Coordinator. So this is the person that would be in charge of the 8th grade administration should the test coordinator be unable to do so. Start thinking about your grade 8 SSD coordinator. This is the person responsible for submitting accommodation requests on behalf of your students in 8th grade. Start thinking about your proctors. And so for those of you who are familiar with administering our assessments, we used to call these associate supervisors, but starting in the 2018-19 school year, we're changing that name to proctors. So the proctors are the person in the testing room responsible for reading the testing scripts to the students and actually administering the test to the students. And then you also have your monitors. These are formally known as hall proctors or room proctors, but again, next year we're going to start calling them monitors. These are people within the hallways or the testing rooms that can assist the proctor or the coordinator as directed. They're essentially just helpers as needed. And as we go, again, throughout the 2018-19 school year, we'll talk about who those people should be and any restrictions that those people may need to have. The general timeline of activities for the 2018-19 school year. In September through December timeframe, you're going to identify and designate your test coordinator and SSD coordinator. And then you're going to ensure that your school is established to test in 2019. And when we say established to test, we mean that you're set up in the College Board systems to administer the assessments. Key thing here is that Spotlight is going to be your main communication device so that we can tell you information that you need to know. So if you're not aware, the Spotlight newsletter is provided by the Michigan Department of Education. It comes out every Thursday afternoon. And again, this is your one-stop shop for any kind of assessment news for the MD provided assessments. So all of these kind of activities that you see on the screen here will provide information in Spotlight next year for these activities. The establishment piece is going to be a very important one because if you're not established to test, you're not going to be able to provide the test to your students. So keep an eye out in Spotlight, and I'll tell you in future slides how to sign up for Spotlight if you don't currently receive that newsletter. Also in the September through December timeline, we want to start requesting accommodations in SSD Online. In the January through March timeframe, you'll receive confirmation of your AI code. Your AI code stands for Attending Institution Code, and this is the code that connects your students to your school for College Board assessments. So this is a 6-digit number. It likely starts with 23. It is different than your Michigan provided district or building codes. This is a code that is specific to College Board assessments. And if you don't already have one, you will be assigned one, and you will likely receive that confirmation in January. January is also when you'll start to pre-ID your students in the secure site. You'll continue to request accommodations in SSD Online as needed and monitor their approvals. Start thinking about room and staff planning and develop room rosters, and then make sure your test-based staff is trained. In mid-March, you'll receive your testing materials, and April is when you will administer the test. May is important because it's when the answer document verification window opens in the secure site, and this is where you have the ability to and important for accountability to make sure that we have all of the answer documents that you sent back, and also to make any appeals based on that information in the secure site. And then once all of those answer document verification window is complete and all the activities of that is complete, then scores get released to educators in the K-12 reporting portal in the June-July timeframe. Students will receive their scores earlier, but educators will not receive scores until the answer document verification window is complete. So again, just a general, very general list of activities. Look for Spotlight for more detailed information about those. Now we'll talk about the supports that are available for your students. First off, your English learners. Students can use translated test directions and/or approved word-for-word bilingual glossaries without prior approval. Translated test directions for designated languages are in PDF format and must be printed by the school ahead of test day. So because you don't need prior approval, we don't know what specific languages you need, so we'll just provide them in PDF format and you'll print them out for your students to use. We have a certain number of languages that are translated in PDF format, but for those that are not, translated test directions can be provided orally by an approved translator to the student in those languages that are not available in PDF format. We will post an approved glossary list and the languages available for the translated test directions in the 2018-19 school year. If you're familiar with our assessments and providing those to your 9th, 10th, or 11th graders, one thing to note here is that our approved glossary list is going to be expanding significantly in the 2018-19 school year, and we should have around 100 glossaries that will be approved for student use in the 2018-19 school year. So again, look for that list later this fall. Also, something that is new to all assessments within the SAT suite of assessments for 2018-19 is that English learners can be provided with 50% extended time. The details for how to get approval or how to utilize this support is still being determined. So again, keep your eye out on Spotlight for information on if your students need to use extended time. Now let's get into accommodations. So all accommodations for the Michigan provided assessments in spring, which again include the PSAT 8-9 for 8th and 9th grade, PSAT 10, and the SAT with essay, must have prior approval and be requested to the College Board Services for Students with Disabilities, or SSD, online system. If your school provides for a fall administration of the PSAT 8-9 for 8th or 9th grade students, which again is not provided by the state, approval in SSD online is not required but suggested if your students require accommodations. So that's a big difference between fall and spring testing. For fall, they do not have to have approval, but for spring, they do. The process to request accommodations is meant only for students with diagnosed disabilities according to an IEP or 504 plan. Schools should designate an SSD coordinator that has access to SSD online and submits the requests on the behalf of students. Schools can have multiple SSD coordinators to submit requests. However, later this fall, we will ask you to identify one SSD coordinator as the primary SSD coordinator that will receive communications from the College Board. But you can have multiple in the system to submit accommodation requests. Most requests are approved automatically within a few days and require no submission of documentation. However, there are some requests that will require documentation be submitted, and these could take up to 7 weeks for review. So let's talk about the process of requesting accommodation. So first of all, the SSD coordinator has to request access to SSD online, and information about how to do this will be available this fall. Once the SSD coordinator requests access, they will receive and use an access code to gain access to SSD online. Once they have access to SSD online, then the SSD coordinator submits accommodation requests on behalf of the student. Within SSD online, then, there are two process flows for approvals. The one process flow that is considered the best practice for 8th grade is what we call the state allowed process. The acceptable process that you can certainly use, but we would recommend the state allowed, but an acceptable process is what we call the College Board approval process. And really the main difference between these two processes is that once approved, students remain approved for accommodations through the College Board approval process, whereas the state allowed process is only good for the Michigan provided administration, and it's only good for 1 year. As I mentioned, both processes are acceptable. However, for 8th grade students only, applying for state allowed accommodations is recommended by the Michigan Department of Education, as this process really follows best practices in special education. And let's talk about those two differences, these two process flows, a little bit more. So first of all, the state allowed process. Again, it's best practice in special education because the transitional IEP 504 is written based on the needs of the student going into high school, not necessarily what has been used in the middle school or the junior high. The state allowed process, they are automatically approved and absolutely no documentation is required for the state allowed process. They're valid for only 1 year and are only used for the state assessments. If a state allowed accommodation is used, the students, the schools, and MDE will receive scores. Currently, the timeline for these requests, and we're still kind of finalizing these, but currently it starts in early January and ends in mid-February. So because no documentation is required, they go right in. Essentially, you're just putting those requests in the system. The main difference, or the key thing here, is that if a student is approved for a state-allowed accommodation, reapplication is required in 9th grade. So the school will either apply for a state-allowed accommodation again in 9th grade, or the College Board approval process when the student becomes a 9th grader based on their needs in their transitional IEP or 504. So that's kind of the state-allowed flow. The College Board approval flow is acceptable. It puts the students into the SSD system. However, the accommodations that the students use in 8th grade may not be appropriate for 9th grade. Most of these that go through the College Board approval process will be what we call school verified. So you essentially say, yes, this accommodation is on the student's 504 or their IEP, and they're using it on school assessments. And so therefore they're automatically approved within a few days. The College Board approval process, the student remains approved for that accommodation until the IEP or 504 changes, and it could be used on other College Board assessments. So if a student is approved for extended time in 8th grade through the College Board approval process, that extended time will stay in the system in 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade, and even for AP exams if your student takes any of those as well. For some requests, documentation will be required under this process flow. If documentation is required, approvals can take up to 7 weeks, so we want you to start early. Students, schools, and MDE will receive scores for students who use College Board approved accommodations. The timeline for requests, essentially once your school has an AI code, that attending institution code, you could start now if you really wanted to. And typically the deadline is around mid-February. And again, the big difference between the state allowed and the College Board approved is that the student remains approved for that accommodation unless the IEP or 504 requires a change. Using this process does not change the IEP's team obligation to review a student's needs and supports at each IEP review. So if you're wondering, how am I going to know which kind of process flow I'm in? Once you go into SSD Online, the typical flow is the College Board approval flow. Starting in January, or whenever we kind of turn that state allowed process on, there will be a link at the top of SSD Online that takes you into the state allowed process flow. So if you just go in now, if you went in today actually, you would be going into the College Board approval flow. Whenever we turn on the state allowed process flow, and we'll again let you know when that's going to be ahead of time, there will be a link, and then that's where you would go into the state allowed process flow. So you probably have lots more questions about accommodations. More information about accommodation requests, the type of accommodations available, and how to make the decision of what process flow to use will be available later this fall. So types of accommodations, the list of accommodations. Keep in mind that the College Board will accept any request for accommodations. It may not be approved, but any request is looked at. So more information about accommodations will come later. So as you transition to this PSAT 8-9 administration, the College Board and MDE are here to support you in a variety of ways. So as I've mentioned a few times before, the most important way is to really utilize the Spotlight newsletter. This will have reminders about implementation activities and information such as face-to-face implementation workshops that the Michigan Field Team will be administering this fall and winter. It will have information about webinars, online training that's available. The College Board is going to put out what we call an implementation handbook that kind of is a step-by-step guide on these are the things that you need to do to get your school ready. And then MDE is also going to provide an assessment coordinator training guide, which will cover all of the MDE assessments. But Spotlight's really going to be the go-to place for you. I know it's a lot of information, but it's the one-stop shop. If you do not currently receive the Spotlight newsletter, you can go to michigan.gov/OEAA and then scroll down to the Spotlight newsletter where you can sign up for that listserv. We also have a Michigan Field Team that is within the state of Michigan to support you and provide you with training and answer your questions. And the members of the Michigan Field Team are Ted Gardella, Jason Feig, and Carrie Anima, and their emails are listed on the screen in case you have questions for them. They would be more than happy to answer those. So if you're a go-getter and you really need to know what do I need to do now, there's not a whole lot to do right now, actually. So before the end of this school year, again, sign up for the Spotlight newsletter if you haven't, and start beginning to think about who may serve as your test day staff for the PSAT 8-9 administration for your 8th graders. And then when the 2018-19 school year begins, keep reading Spotlight for information on registering for implementation webinars or workshops that are available. You're going to designate your test coordinator, your backup test coordinator, and your SSD coordinator, and that's going to occur in the EEM, the Educational Entity Master. And again, we'll talk about that more this fall. You'll also want to have your test coordinator, your backup coordinator, and your SSD coordinator register for a College Board professional account at collegeboard.org if they don't already have one. If they have one, they don't need another one. You just need one account. And then the SSD coordinator should request access to SSD Online. Again, information will be provided in Spotlight. I would also highly encourage you, if you're a middle school or junior high, to connect with your high school colleagues because they've done this for the last few years now. So they kind of have the processes down, and they'll be a great resource for you as you plan your 8th grade administration. So thank you for your time today. As you have additional questions, again, use the Michigan Field Team. Also, if you go to the College Board website, so if you just go to collegeboard.org, note that the Michigan provided assessments will have different requirements than what we post on that general collegeboard.org website. So be sure to adhere to information and deadlines that are available at collegeboard.org/Michigan, which will have Michigan-specific information. And on the MDE side, if you go to michigan.gov/OEAA, they will have information about the Michigan-specific assessments. If you have questions about the secure site, eligibility to test, accountability questions, you're going to want to contact MDE about those. You can call 877-560-8378 and select the correct option, or the email addresses on your screen for assessment questions or accountability questions. So thank you for your time today. We look forward to supporting you in your 2018-19 school year as you administer the PSAT 8-9 for 8th graders. Thank you very much.